June 1942. The Eastern Front. German soldiers huddled in their trenches near Stalingrad heard a sound that made their blood run cold. It wasn't the roar of Soviet bombers or the thunder of artillery. It was something far more terrifying, a soft whistling sound, like a witch's broomstick cutting through the night sky. The Germans called them Nachthexen, the night witches, and they were unlike any enemy the Wehrmacht had ever faced. These weren't hardened male pilots flying state-of-the-art fighters. They were teenage girls, some as young as 17, flying wooden canvas biplanes that were older than they were. Their aircraft had no radios, no radar, no parachutes, and no protection from enemy fire. Yet these young women would fly more combat missions than any other Soviet unit and become the most decorated female pilots in history. This is their story. By the summer of 1941, the Soviet Union was bleeding to death. Hitler's Operation Barbarossa had smashed through Soviet defenses with 3 million German troops, the largest invasion force in human history. Within weeks, the Wehrmacht had captured millions of Soviet soldiers, destroyed thousands of tanks and aircraft, and was racing toward Moscow. Stalin's Red Army was in full retreat, leaving a trail of burned villages and mass graves across the vast Russian landscape. The Soviet Air Force had been virtually destroyed on the ground in the first days of the war. Thousands of aircraft were caught lined up on airfields, easy targets for German bombers that struck at dawn. The pilots who survived found themselves flying obsolete planes against the Luftwaffe's experienced aces and superior fighters. Every day brought news of more losses, more retreats, more territory surrendered to the Nazi invaders. The situation was so desperate that Stalin issued Order 227, not one step back, threatening to shoot any soldier who retreated without orders. Into this catastrophe stepped a woman who would change the course of aerial warfare forever. Marina Raskova was already a Soviet hero, having set multiple long-distance flight records before the war. She was famous, respected, and had Stalin's personal ear of A, combination that made her one of the few people in the Soviet Union who could propose something radical and actually get it approved. What she proposed was unthinkable. All-female combat aviation regiments that would fight alongside men on the deadliest front of World War II. The idea seemed insane to the Soviet military establishment, which had never allowed women in combat roles despite the communist ideology of equality. Military commanders argued that women lacked the physical strength for combat flying, that they would crack under pressure, that they would distract male pilots. But Raskova had seen thousands of letters from young Soviet women begging for the chance to fight for their homeland. She knew that the Soviet Union needed every pilot it could get, and she was determined to prove that women could fight just as fiercely as men. On October 8, 1941, Stalin signed the order creating 3 all-female aviation regiments: a fighter regiment, a dive bomber regiment, and a night bomber regiment. Within days, Raskova was flooded with applications from women across the Soviet Union. Factory workers, university students, teachers, and even high school girls wrote desperate letters begging to be accepted. They came from cities that were under siege, from villages that had been burned, from families that had lost fathers and brothers to the Nazi invasion. The selection process was brutal because Raskova could only accept a fraction of the thousands who applied. She looked for women who already had flying experience, whether from aviation clubs, crop dusting operations, or civilian flight schools. She needed women who could handle the physical demands of combat flying in primitive aircraft at high altitude. Most importantly, she needed women who understood that many of them would not survive the war. The acceptance rate was less than 5%, and those who made it through knew they had earned their place through merit, not favoritism. Among those accepted was Nadezhda Popova, a 19-year-old who had learned to fly before she learned to drive. Yevgenia Jigolenko had been a flying instructor before the war and jumped at the chance to fight. Irina Sabrova was just 18, but had more flight hours than many male pilots twice her age. Lily Litviak had distinctive blonde hair and would become the world's first female fighter ace. These women and hundreds like them reported to Engels, a small town on the Volga River, where they would be transformed from civilian pilots into combat aviators. The training facility at Engels was freezing, poorly equipped, and overcrowded with eager recruits who had no idea what they were getting into. The women were issued men's uniforms that were far too large, boots that didn't fit, and equipment designed for soldiers twice their size. They had to stuff their boots with newspapers and cut their hair short just to fit into the leather flying helmets. The male instructors were skeptical at best and openly hostile at worst, convinced that this experiment would end in disaster. But the women were determined to prove them wrong, no matter what it took. The aircraft assigned to the Night Bomber Regiment was the Polikarpov Po-2, a biplane so primitive that it seemed to belong in a museum rather than a war zone. Designed in 1928 as a training aircraft and crop duster, the Po-2 had never been intended for combat operations. It was constructed of plywood frames covered with fabric that was painted with aircraft dope to make it somewhat weather-resistant. The maximum speed was just 94 miles per hour, slower than many modern cars on a highway. A strong headwind could literally stop the plane in mid-air, forcing it to hover like a helicopter. The Po-2 had no radio equipment because radios were too heavy for the fragile airframe to carry. There was no radar, no gun sights, no bomb sights, and no instruments for night flying beyond a basic compass and altimeter. The pilots navigated by following rivers, roads, and railway lines, memorizing the terrain during daylight reconnaissance missions. There were no parachutes because the planes flew too low and too slow for parachutes to deploy before hitting the ground. If the aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire or caught by a German night fighter, the crew had no chance of survival. The bomb load was laughable by military standards. Just 350 pounds of explosives carried in fabric bags under the wings. A single German bomber could carry 10 times that amount and had sophisticated bomb release mechanisms controlled from inside the cockpit. The Po-2 crews had to manually release their bombs by pulling a cord, calculating the drop by instinct and experience rather than any mechanical bomb sight. The aircraft was so flimsy that the concussion from its own bombs could damage the airframe if dropped from too low an altitude. Everything about the Po-2 suggested it would be useless in combat, a death trap that would get its crews killed without accomplishing anything meaningful. Yet the Po-2 had one critical advantage that no one at first recognized. It was too slow and too low flying for German defenses to handle effectively. German fighters had to reduce their speed so much to engage the Po-2 south that they risked stalling their own engines. Anti-aircraft guns designed to track fast-moving bombers couldn't depress low enough or traverse slowly enough to hit the lumbering biplanes. Searchlights would catch them, but shooting them down proved maddeningly difficult. The German military had spent years preparing to fight modern warfare with advanced technology, and now they were being tormented by wooden biplanes that belonged to an earlier era of aviation. The night bombers developed tactics that were as ingenious as they were dangerous. They operated in groups of 3 aircraft, approaching their targets in complete darkness with engines running. As they neared the target area, the first plane would cut its engine and glide silently toward the enemy position. The sound of wind whistling through the wing struts created the eerie noise that Germans compared to a witch's broomstick. The second plane would keep its engine running to draw attention and searchlights away from the gliding bomber. The third plane would circle at a distance, ready to attack if the first 2 ran into trouble. The lead pilot would glide down to extremely low altitude, sometimes as low as 300 feet above the ground, before releasing her bombs and restarting her engine. The sudden roar of the engine returning to life would be the first indication to German troops that they were under attack, and by then, the bombs were already falling. The explosion would light up the night sky as the bomber climbed away, and immediately the second plane would cut its engine and begin its own silent approach. This pattern would continue throughout the night, with planes taking turns gliding in, bombing, and returning to base for more munitions. A typical mission involved flying 8 to 15 sorties per night, landing to refuel and reload bombs between each run. The ground crews worked frantically in the darkness to service the aircraft as quickly as possible, sometimes turning planes around in less than 5 minutes. Pilots and navigators would gulp down tea or soup while mechanics swarmed over their aircraft, patching bullet holes and loading fresh bombs. Then they were back in the air, flying through searchlight beams and anti-aircraft fire to deliver their cargo of death to German positions. Some pilots flew 18 sorties in a single night, spending more time in the air than on the ground. The physical toll was enormous. The open cockpits exposed crews to temperatures that dropped to 40 degrees below zero at altitude. Frostbite was common, and pilots had to constantly move their fingers and toes to prevent freezing. The noise of the engine just feet away caused permanent hearing damage. The stress of repeated combat missions, combined with exhaustion from flying all night and sleeping during the day, pushed pilots to the edge of collapse. Yet they kept flying, night after night, knowing that every bomb they dropped brought the Soviet Union one small step closer to victory. German troops on the receiving end of these attacks were driven to the edge of madness by the night witches. The psychological impact of the raids was far greater than the physical damage they inflicted. Soldiers would hear the whistle of approaching aircraft and dive for cover, not knowing where the bombs would fall. The attacks came randomly throughout the night, making sleep impossible and keeping troops in a constant state of fear. Men who had fought on multiple fronts said they feared the night witches more than they feared massive artillery barrages or tank assaults. The Germans tried everything to stop the night raids, but nothing seemed to work effectively. They deployed additional searchlights, but the Po-2 South were too maneuverable and would dodge the beams by making sharp turns that would tear apart a faster aircraft. They brought in night fighters, but the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs couldn't slow down enough to engage the biplanes without stalling. One German pilot famously complained that attacking a Po-2 was like trying to shoot a hummingbird with a rifle. Anti-aircraft gunners fired thousands of rounds into the darkness, hoping for lucky hits, but the small, slow-moving targets were incredibly difficult to track. In desperation, the Luftwaffe began offering Iron Cross medals to any pilot who could shoot down a night witch, treating it as equivalent to shooting down a heavy bomber. This unusual reward reflected both the frustration of being unable to stop the attacks and the grudging respect German pilots developed for their opponents. Some German units kept detailed logs of night witch attacks, noting with amazement that the same planes would return again and again throughout a single night. Intelligence officers struggled to understand how the Soviets were managing to launch so many sorties with what appeared to be such primitive aircraft. The Germans also spread propaganda about the night witches, portraying them as supernatural beings or criminals released from prison to fight. Some claimed the pilots were drug addicted, or that the Soviets had injected them with special serums to enhance their night vision. These stories reflected the German inability to comprehend that ordinary women, flying antiquated biplanes, were consistently outmaneuvering the mighty Luftwaffe. The truth that courage, skill, and determination could overcome technological superiority was too threatening to German propaganda's narrative of Aryan supremacy. Nadezhda Popova became one of the most famous night witches, flying 852 combat missions, more than almost any other Soviet pilot, male or female. She had joined the regiment at age 19, having learned to fly at a local aviation club before the war. Her first mission terrified her so completely that she vomited after landing, but she climbed back into her aircraft the next night and the night after that. Over time, fear became routine, routine became confidence, and confidence became the cold calculation of a veteran combat pilot who had survived when so many others had died. Popova's aircraft was shot down multiple times, and she survived crashes that should have killed her. On one mission, her plane took 42 bullet holes from ground fire, but remained airborne long enough to limp back to base. Another time, a German shell exploded so close that the concussion flipped her Po-2 upside down, but she managed to right the aircraft and complete her bombing run before returning home. She flew through blizzards, through fog so thick she couldn't see her own wings, through anti-aircraft fire so intense it turned the night sky orange with explosions. Each time she landed safely, she considered it borrowed time, knowing that luck could only hold so long. Her most dangerous mission came in 1943 during the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in human history. German forces had concentrated enormous firepower for a decisive breakthrough, and the Night Witches were ordered to attack the massed armor and artillery positions. Popava's regiment flew continuous missions for 3 nights straight, with pilots so exhausted they had to be helped into their cockpits. She flew 15 sorties in a single night, landing only to reload and refuel before taking off again into the maelstrom of fire. When dawn finally came and the surviving pilots counted their losses, they found that nearly a third of the regiment had been killed or wounded in those 3 nights. But Popova survived the Battle of Kursk, and she survived the war. After the fighting ended, she had flown more combat missions than any American or British pilot, and more than most German aces. She had been shot down multiple times, wounded twice, and had watched dozens of her friends die in burning aircraft. When asked years later how she had coped with the constant fear and loss, she said simply that they had no choice. The Germans had invaded their homeland, and they fought because surrender was unthinkable. Her matter-of-fact tone couldn't hide the steel underneath, the determination that had carried her through 852 missions into hell and back. The price paid by the Night Witches was staggering. Of the approximately 400 women who served in the Night Bomber Regiment during the war, 32 were killed in action. This casualty rate, nearly 8%, doesn't sound catastrophic until you realize these were just the confirmed deaths. Many more were wounded, some multiple times, and returned to flying as soon as they could climb back into a cockpit. Several pilots were listed as missing in action, shot down over enemy territory with no witnesses to their final moments. The psychological casualties were impossible to count. How many women went home after the war haunted by what they had seen and done? One of the most devastating losses was Marina Raskova herself, the woman who had created the female aviation regiments and inspired thousands of women to fight. In January 1943, she was leading a flight of bombers to the front when her aircraft flew into a riverbank during a snowstorm, killing her instantly. Stalin ordered a state funeral, and her ashes were buried in the Kremlin wall, an honor reserved for only the most distinguished Soviet heroes. The Night Witches were devastated by her death, having lost not just their commander, but the woman who had believed in them when no one else did. The casualties came in many forms, not just from combat. Some pilots died in training accidents, their inexperience combining with primitive aircraft to create fatal mistakes. Others died from exhaustion-related crashes after flying too many consecutive missions without adequate rest. A few died from illness, unable to recover in the harsh conditions of frontline airfields where medical care was minimal. The winter of 1942-1943 was particularly brutal, with several pilots dying from pneumonia and other cold-related illnesses that their weakened bodies couldn't fight off. Every death was mourned, every loss remembered, every empty cockpit a reminder of the price being paid. Yet for every pilot killed, another stepped forward to take her place. Young women volunteered, knowing they might not survive, but they volunteered anyway because their country was fighting for its existence. They attended funerals for their friends in the morning and flew combat missions that same night. They wrote letters home that they knew might be their last words to their families. They faced death with a courage that astounded even hardened Soviet military officers who had seen countless men break under the strain of combat. The Night Witches proved that bravery has no gender, that determination can overcome technology, and that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when everything they love is at stake. As the war progressed, the reputation of the Night Witches spread throughout the Soviet military and beyond. Frontline infantry units requested their support specifically, knowing that when the Po-2 South appeared overhead, German troops would spend the night cowering in their bunkers instead of launching attacks. Soviet commanders began to understand that the psychological impact of the night raids was worth far more than the tonnage of explosives delivered. A single night witch bombing a German position all night could be more effective than a massive artillery barrage that lasted only a few minutes. Individual pilots became celebrities within the Soviet Union as their accomplishments became known. Lily Litviak, who transferred from the night bombers to fighters, shot down 12 German aircraft before being killed in action at age 21. Katya Budanova, another fighter pilot, was credited with 11 kills before her death. Yevgenia Jigalenko of the night bombers flew 968 combat missions and survived the war to become a film director. Each woman had her own story of courage, loss, and determination that inspired millions of Soviet citizens enduring the hardships of total war. The Soviet government awarded 23 night witches the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest military decoration. Hundreds more received the Order of the Red Banner, the Order of the Red Star, and various campaign medals for specific battles. Yet many of the women felt that the true heroes were those who hadn't survived to receive their medals, those who had died in flames over German positions, or who had simply vanished into the night. The decorations were accepted on behalf of all the women who had served, living and dead, who had proven that they were the equals of any male pilot in courage and skill. International recognition came more slowly, partly because the Soviet Union was secretive about military details during the Cold War. It wasn't until decades after the war that Western historians began to understand the full scope of what the Night Witches had accomplished. American and British pilots who had fought on the Western Front were amazed to learn that Soviet women had flown more combat missions than almost any Allied pilots. The Night Witches had rewritten the rules of aerial warfare, proving that innovation and courage could defeat technological superiority, and that warriors came in unexpected forms. The psychological burden carried by the Night Witches was immense, though few spoke of it during the war. These were young women, many still teenagers, who were dropping bombs on human beings night after night. They saw the explosions, saw the fires they started, heard the screams of wounded men in the darkness below. Some tried to rationalize it by remembering what the Germans had done to Soviet villages and cities, the mass murders and atrocities that the Wehrmacht had committed. Others simply shut off their emotions and did their jobs, knowing that thinking too much about the consequences would make it impossible to continue. Sleep became a luxury that few could afford. The regiment flew at night and tried to sleep during the day, but the airfields were subject to German bombing raids that made rest nearly impossible. Even when conditions were quiet, many pilots lay awake thinking about friends who had been killed or worrying about the mission they would fly that night. Some developed rituals, lucky scarves, specific pre-flight routines, prayers to gods they didn't officially believe in under Stalin's atheist regime. These small acts of control gave them the illusion that they had some power over their fate, even though they knew that luck and death were entirely random. Romance bloomed even in these impossible circumstances, as young people in constant proximity to death grabbed whatever happiness they could find. Some night witches married mechanics or ground crew members, creating brief moments of normalcy in the chaos of war. Nadezhda Popova married a fighter pilot she met at the front, both of them understanding that every day together might be their last. Other relationships were more tragic women who fell in love with men who were killed in combat, or who lost touch with sweethearts as the front moved and communication became impossible. The war consumed everything, even love, leaving only duty and survival. The mental health consequences weren't understood or addressed at the time. Soviet military culture emphasized stoicism and denied the existence of what we now call PTSD. Pilots who showed signs of psychological distress were labeled as weak or cowardly, creating enormous pressure to hide any symptoms. Women who broke down were quietly removed from combat duty and never spoke of what they had experienced. Only decades after the war, when survivors began to tell their stories, did the full psychological price become apparent. Many night witches had nightmares for the rest of their lives, woke screaming from dreams of burning aircraft, or could never bear to fly again after the war ended. By 1943, the tide of war on the Eastern Front had turned decisively in favor of the Soviet Union. The Germans had been stopped at Stalingrad in a battle that cost both sides hundreds of thousands of casualties. The Battle of Kursk broke the back of German offensive capability, destroying thousands of tanks and aircraft that the Wehrmacht could never replace. Soviet forces were now advancing westward, liberating territory that had been under Nazi occupation for 2 years. The Night Witches advanced with the Red Army, operating from temporary airfields that moved every few weeks as the front lines shifted. The missions became even more dangerous as the regiment moved closer to German territory. The Luftwaffe was fighting desperately to slow the Soviet advance, and German anti-aircraft defenses grew thicker as the bombers approached industrial centers and military bases inside Germany itself. Several night witches were shot down over German soil and taken prisoner, where they faced interrogation and imprisonment under harsh conditions. The Germans couldn't understand why the Soviets were using women as combat pilots, and their treatment of captured female flyers ranged from confused disbelief to outright brutality. Some captured night witches were never seen again. Yet the bombing missions continued without pause, night after night across Poland and into Germany. The night witches attacked railway yards, supply depots, troop concentrations, and industrial facilities. They dropped leaflets encouraging German soldiers to surrender and demoralizing enemy troops who already knew the war was lost. The psychological warfare aspect of their missions became even more important as German morale collapsed. Wehrmacht soldiers, hearing the whistle of Po-2 South overhead, knew that the Soviet Union, which they had been told was defeated in 1941, was now bombing their homeland. The Night Witches had become a symbol of German failure and Soviet resilience. The final missions were flown in the spring of 1945 as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin. Night Witches bombed German positions defending the capital, supporting the massive ground offensive that would end the war in Europe. Some pilots flew their last combat missions just days before Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945. When the order finally came that hostilities had ceased, many Night Witches couldn't believe it. They had been at war for so long that peace seemed like an impossible dream. They had survived when so many others hadn't, and now they faced the daunting challenge of returning to normal life after years of living on the edge of death. The end of the war brought relief, but also profound sadness for the surviving Night Witches. They had lived through hell together, forged bonds that civilians could never understand, and now they were being disbanded and sent home to civilian life. The regiment held a final ceremony where decorations were distributed and speeches were made about their heroic service. Then the women packed their few belongings, said tearful goodbyes to friends they might never see again, and scattered across the vast Soviet Union to pick up the pieces of lives interrupted by war. Readjustment to civilian life proved incredibly difficult for many veterans. Soviet society in 1945 had no concept of what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Women who had nightmares or anxiety attacks were told to be strong and not complain. Those who had difficulty holding jobs or maintaining relationships were seen as weak rather than wounded. The Soviet government, eager to return to traditional gender roles after the war, downplayed the contributions of female soldiers and pushed women back into domestic roles. Many Night Witches found themselves unable to get jobs as pilots despite having more combat experience than most male aviators. Some adapted better than others to peacetime. Nadezhda Popova became a flight instructor, passing on her skills to a new generation of Soviet pilots. Yevgenia Jigulenko went to film school and became a successful director. Others married, raised families, and tried to forget the war years. A few couldn't adjust at all and died young from alcohol-related causes or suicide, casualties of a war that continued long after the shooting stopped. The survivors stayed in touch when possible, attending reunions where they could talk freely about experiences that other people didn't want to hear about or couldn't understand. For decades, the story of the Night Witches remained largely unknown outside the Soviet Union. The Cold War meant that Soviet military history wasn't widely studied in the West, and many historians dismissed stories about female combat pilots as propaganda. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s, when surviving Night Witches began giving interviews and writing memoirs, that the full truth emerged. These women had flown more combat missions than almost any other pilots in history, had terrified the German military, and had proven that courage and determination know no gender. Their story was finally being told, decades late, but no less remarkable for the delay. Today, the Night Witches are recognized as pioneers of women in combat aviation and as heroes of World War II. Their example inspired generations of women to pursue careers as military, pilots, astronauts, and aviation professionals. Countries around the world have opened combat aviation roles to women, citing the Night Witches as proof that gender is no barrier to flying skill or combat effectiveness. Modern female fighter pilots in the U.S. Air Force, the Israeli Air Force, and other services acknowledge their debt to the Soviet women who proved it was possible 80 years ago. In Russia, the Night Witches are honored with monuments, museums, and annual commemorations. Their aircraft, the humble Po-2 biplane, is preserved in multiple aviation museums as a reminder that technological sophistication isn't always necessary for military effectiveness. Streets and schools have been named after famous Night Witches, ensuring that new generations learn about their courage. The story has been told in books, documentaries, and films, each retelling introducing new audiences to these remarkable women who flew wooden biplanes into hell and came back to tell about it. The military lessons of the Night Witches remain relevant today. They prove that psychological warfare can be as effective as high explosives, that persistence and courage can overcome technological disadvantages, and that unconventional tactics can defeat superior forces. Modern military strategists study their operations as examples of innovative thinking and adaptive tactics. The concept of using slow, quiet aircraft for night harassment operations has been replicated in various conflicts since World War II, always owing a debt to the original Night Witches who pioneered these tactics under the most desperate circumstances imaginable. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Night Witches is the simple demonstration of human courage under impossible odds. These were ordinary young women who did extraordinary things because their country needed them. They faced fear every night and flew anyway. They watched friends die and kept fighting. They endured exhaustion, cold, hunger, and terror, yet they never quit. Their example reminds us that heroes aren't superhuman. They're ordinary people who refuse to surrender when surrender would be easier. The Night Witches showed the world what women could accomplish when given the opportunity, and their legacy continues to inspire courage in all of us who face our own battles, whatever form they may take. From 1942 to 1945, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment flew over 23,000 combat sorties and dropped more than 20,000 tons of bombs on German targets. 23 women received the Hero of the Soviet Union Award, and hundreds more were decorated for valor in combat. They achieved all this flying open-cockpit biplanes that had been obsolete before the war began, armed with nothing but courage, skill, and determination. The Germans called them Night Witches and feared the sound of their approach in the darkness. But they were not witches or supernatural beings. They were women, most of them teenagers, when they first went into combat. They were daughters, sisters, friends who had volunteered to defend their homeland against an enemy that had brought unprecedented horror to Soviet soil. They paid a terrible price for their service, with dozens killed in action and many more carrying physical and psychological wounds for the rest of their lives. Yet they never hesitated, never complained, never asked for special treatment. They simply did their jobs with a professionalism and bravery that earned the respect of everyone who fought beside them. History has many examples of courage under fire, but few can match the sustained heroism of the Night Witches, flying their dangerous missions night after night for 3 years. They were teenagers doing a job that terrified hardened combat veterans, flying in conditions that would ground modern aircraft, armed with weapons that would be considered toys by today's standards. Yet they succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, proving that human courage and determination can overcome any obstacle. Their story deserves to be remembered and retold, a testament to what people can accomplish when they refuse to accept that something is impossible. The last of the Night Witches passed away in recent years, taking with them the first-hand memories of those desperate nights over the Eastern Front. But their legacy lives on in every woman who puts on a flight suit, in every person who refuses to be limited by others' expectations, in everyone who faces fear and keeps moving forward anyway. The Night Witches showed us that heroes come in unexpected forms, that courage has no gender, and that determination and skill can overcome any technological disadvantage. Their wooden biplanes are gone, but their spirit endures. The spirit of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, because the alternative was surrender, and surrender was never an option.